Once a month, he laid his ruin at her feet. She held his whole world in a ledger and called it justice. He gave her nothing to soften toward, but some debts bleed in a coin no book can count. We begin our story now. The rain had been falling on London for 3 days without apology, and it drummed against the tall window of the office as if it meant to get in. Hermione Granger did not look up when the clock on the mantel struck 9. She had trained herself not to. The sound of it, the small bronze cough before the chime, was the sound she had come to associate with the first working day of every month, and she had decided, long ago, that she would not give him the satisfaction of watching the door. He was never early. He was never late. He arrived precisely on the hour, as though punctuality were the last dignity left to him, and he intended to hoard it. The door opened. Cold air moved into the room ahead of him, carrying the wet wool smell of the corridor and something sharper beneath it. The faint metallic trace of a warming charm gone stale on damp fabric. She kept her eyes on the ledger open before her, on the neat columns of her own handwriting, and let him stand there in the doorway for the length of one long breath. "Malfoy," she said. "Granger." Only then did she raise her head. He looked, as he always looked now, like a portrait of himself that someone had left too long in the sun. The fine bones were the same. The pale hair, combed back with a precision that spoke of habit rather than vanity, was the same. But the coat was 3 winters old, brushed and rebrushed until the nap had worn thin at the cuffs, and the silver ring on his right hand, the signet with the coiled serpent, had been turned inward, so the crest pressed against his palm instead of announcing itself to the world. He had taken to hiding it. She had noticed that months ago and had never mentioned it, filing the observation away with all the other small things she noticed and did not say. "Sit," she told him. He sat. He always sat exactly as she asked, and there was an insolence in the very perfection of his obedience, a way of doing precisely what she demanded that made a mockery of her demanding it. Between them lay the desk, wide and dark and official, and on it the ledger, and in the ledger the whole ruined architecture of his family's fortune reduced to figures she controlled. This was the arrangement. This had been the arrangement for 11 months, and it would be the arrangement for as long as the Meliora Restitution Trust decreed the Malfoy debt unpaid, which was to say for years, for a decade, perhaps for the rest of his natural life. Once a month, he came to her. Once a month, he laid his accounts before her and answered whatever she chose to ask, and left with whatever she chose to leave him. The law required his presence. The law did not require that she be the one to receive him. The trust employed a dozen administrators who could have done the work. But she had put her name against his file the day the case landed on her desk, and no one had questioned it. She had told herself it was efficiency. She was the most senior officer. His was the largest claim. It was only sensible. She had told herself a great many things. "Your monthly declaration," she said, and held out her hand. He drew the folded parchment from inside his coat and passed it across. Their fingers did not touch. He was careful of that, always, arranging the geometry of every exchange so that no part of him met any part of her. And she had never decided whether that carefulness was contempt or something else she did not want to name. She unfolded the parchment. It had the particular texture of the good stationery he still absurdly insisted upon. Heavy, faintly ridged, the tooth of it rough under her thumb. Everything else in his life had been sold or seized, and still he wrote his declarations of poverty on paper that cost more than most families spent on bread. There was something in that she found almost unbearable, though she could not have said whether what she felt was scorn or a reluctant, unwilling pity. She read. The columns marched down the page in his narrow, upright hand. The Wiltshire property, still under trust lien, still generating the rents that went every quarter into the fund she administered, into the rebuilding of the villages his war had helped to burn. The London holdings, liquidated. The vault at Gringotts, audited, sealed, drawn down to the statutory minimum. The art, the furniture, the wine that his grandfather had laid down before the last war but one. Line after line of loss, itemized in his own careful script, as though he were the clerk of his own dismantling. She had read 100 such pages. She had grown used to the strange intimacy of watching a man account for his own ruin. And yet, this month, halfway down the second column, her eye caught on a figure and stopped. She read it again. A private sale. A miscellany of personal effects, unlisted, disposed of through a broker in Knockturn Alley whose name she did not recognize. The proceeds, a sum both too large to ignore and too small to matter to the debt, entered under a heading he had left, uncharacteristically, blank. Draco Malfoy did not leave things blank. In 11 months, she had never once caught him in an omission, never found a figure that did not reconcile, never had cause to send a declaration back for correction. He was scrupulous to the point of cruelty, as if the very thoroughness of his surrender were a way of denying her the pleasure of finding fault. It was the one weapon he had left, and he wielded it without mercy. He would give her nothing to punish. And here was a blank. She looked up. He was sitting very straight, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the middle distance somewhere over her shoulder, at the grey window and the grey rain beyond it. He had the stillness of a man waiting for pain he had already decided to bear without sound. She had seen that stillness in him before, and had read it, always, as arrogance, the refusal of a Malfoy to give her the dignity of a reaction. She was less certain, suddenly, that arrogance was the word. "There's an entry here," she said, keeping her voice level, with no attribution. A private sale. Effects unlisted, buyer unnamed, purpose left blank. She turned the parchment and slid it across the desk so the offending line faced him. Explain it. Something moved in his face. It was very small, a tightening at the corner of the jaw, a flicker of the pale lashes, and then it was gone, smoothed over so quickly that a less watchful person would have missed it. But she was watchful. She had spent 11 months learning the small country of his face, and she knew when its weather changed. "It's a private sale," he said, "as stated." "Of what?" "Personal effects, as stated." "Whose?" "Mine." "A beat, as stated." She set down her quill. The rain filled the silence, patient and relentless, and somewhere below them in the building, a door closed and footsteps receded down a stone corridor and were swallowed. "You've never left an entry blank before," she said. Then perhaps you've caught me improving. I understood the trust valued efficiency above ceremony. The trust values complete declarations. An incomplete one is a violation of the terms of your reparation. I could hold you in default over a blank line, Malfoy. I could seize the Wiltshire rents this quarter and let you explain to your tenants why. She said it flatly, without heat, and watched the words land. So, I'll ask you a third time, and I'd advise you to answer. What did you sell, and why won't you name it? For a moment, she thought he would tell her. His hand, the one with the ring turned inward, closed slowly against his thigh, the knuckles going white beneath the pale skin, the silver crest biting into his palm with a pressure she could see, even if she could not feel it. His breath went shallow. Whatever the blank concealed, it was not a trifle. It cost him something, even to sit in the same room as the question. And then the stillness came down over him again, complete and seamless, like water closing over a stone. "Hold me in default, then," he said quietly, "if that's what the ledger requires." He met her eyes for the first time since he'd entered the room, and there was no plea in his look, no flinch, nothing she could use. Only a flat grey resolve, and beneath it, buried so deep she might have imagined it, something that looked, for one impossible instant, like fear. Not fear of her. She was almost certain of that. Fear of the answer. Fear of what naming the blank would mean. "Take the rents, if you like," he went on, and his voice did not shake. "Take Wiltshire. You've taken everything else, and I've signed for all of it, and I'll sign for this too. But I won't fill in that line. Some things aren't yours to have, Granger. Not even now." The rain went on falling. She looked at him, at the worn cuffs and the hidden ring, and the white-knuckled hand, and the grey eyes that would not give her what she asked. And she understood with a slow and unwelcome certainty that she had misjudged something. That the loathing she had built her mornings around, the clean and righteous loathing she had permitted herself for 11 months, because it was owed to her, and to the dead, and to the girl who had screamed on his drawing-room floor, had been aimed at a shape that did not entirely exist. She did not know yet what stood in its place, but she knew she was going to find out, and she knew, with a sinking that felt almost like grief, that finding out was going to cost her the one thing she had allowed herself in all of this, the simple, sustaining pleasure of being right. She picked up her quill again. Her hand, she was displeased to note, was not entirely steady. "This declaration is accepted under protest," she said. "The blank entry is noted as an open question. You'll return in 30 days, and you'll return prepared to answer it." She did not look at him as she spoke. She looked at the ledger, at the safe familiar columns, at anything but the grey eyes across the desk. "You may go." He rose. He gathered his worn coat about him with the terrible, unbroken elegance of a man who had lost everything except the way he stood. At the door he paused, one hand on the frame, and she felt his hesitation like a change in pressure in the room, like the held breath before thunder. She thought he might speak. He did not. He inclined his head, a small, precise, maddening courtesy, and stepped out into the corridor, and the door closed behind him, and his footsteps went away down the stone and faded into the rain sound and were gone. Hermione sat alone in the office with the ledger open before her and the blank lines staring up from the page, and for a long time she did not move at all. The blank line did not leave her. For 30 days, it followed Hermione through the ordinary business of her office, through the audits and the tenancy disputes, the applications for relief, and the endless reconciliation of what had been taken against what was owed. She would be signing a warrant or reviewing a claim, and the memory of it would rise unbidden. The narrow, upright hand, the sum too large to ignore and too small to matter, the heading left deliberately, defiantly empty. And beneath the memory, the other thing, the white knuckles, the ring biting into his palm, the grey eyes that had shown her, for one unguarded instant, something she had no framework to hold. She told herself it was the affront to procedure that gnawed at her. An incomplete declaration was a violation, and violations demanded resolution, and she was a woman who resolved things. That was all it was. That was all it could be. She almost believed it. When the first working day of the month came around again, the rain had gone, and in its place lay the peculiar clarity that follows a long wet spell in autumn, a washed and brittle light that came slanting through the tall window and fell in a hard, bright rectangle across her desk. She had arranged the papers she needed. She had rehearsed, without admitting to herself that she was rehearsing, the sequence of questions she meant to put to him. She had decided she would not be moved. The clock coughed its small bronze cough and struck 9. The door opened. He came in with a light full on him, and she saw at once that the month had not been kind. There was a greyness to him that had nothing to do with the pallor of his colouring, a thinness under the eyes, a way of holding himself as though something ached that he would not name. The coat was the same worn coat. The ring was still turned inward, but he moved more slowly, more carefully, and when he sat, he did not fold his hands in his lap as he always had. He kept the right one closed loosely in his coat pocket, out of sight, and she found her gaze drawn to that concealment before she caught herself and looked away. Malfoy. Granger. She did not offer him the small courtesies she offered other debtors. She never had, and he did not seem to expect them. He waited, still and grey in the hard, bright light, for her to begin. "Before we address your declaration," she said, "there's a prior matter, the contested asset." Something crossed his face. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of grim recognition, the look of a man who has been braced for one blow and receives a different one. "The library," he said. "The library." It was, of all the disputed remnants of the Malfoy estate, the one that had refused to be resolved. The great collection at the manor, thousands of volumes, some of them older than the ministry itself, a few of them the only surviving copies of texts that predated the founding of Hogwarts, had been placed under joint lien 3 years ago, pending a determination of what might lawfully be sold to service the debt, and what must, by an obscure provision of the reparations statute, be preserved as cultural patrimony and held in trust for the wizarding public. For 3 years the determination had been deferred. Neither side had pressed it. She had assumed, in her more cynical moments, that he was content to let the matter sleep, because a sleeping question could not be answered against him. She had been wrong about a good many of her assumptions concerning Draco Malfoy. She was beginning to suspect this was another. "The Trust wishes to conclude the matter," she said. "There's to be an inventory. A physical audit of the collection, volume by volume, to establish what may be liquidated and what must be preserved. It requires the presence of the debtor to attest to the provenance of each item." She paused. "It requires, in short, that you and I spend rather more than an hour a month in one another's company." She watched the news reach him. She had expected, if she was honest, braced herself for some flare of the old venom, some cutting remark about being made to catalogue the ruins of his own house for her amusement. It would have been easier if he had given it to her. It would have restored the clean geometry of their arrangement, the debtor and the creditor, the guilty and the wronged. He gave her nothing of the kind. "When?" he said only. "The audit begins next week. It will take some days, perhaps longer." She turned a page of the schedule before her, though she knew its contents by heart, because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that was not his face. "You'll travel to the manor each morning. I'll meet you there. The Trust has assigned me to conduct the inventory personally." At this, he was quiet for a long moment. "You'll come to the house," he said. Not a question. There was something strange in the way he said it. Not anger, not the humiliation she might have predicted, but a low and careful flatness, the tone of a man setting something heavy down with great deliberation so that it would not break. "You'll walk through it." And she understood belatedly what she was asking of him. Not merely that he account for his books, that she return to the manor, that she cross again the threshold of the house where his aunt had held her on the floor of the drawing room and cut the word into her arm and made her scream until her voice gave out. That she walk those corridors as the auditor of his ruin, in the full and terrible reversal of everything that house had once meant. She had not thought of it as cruelty. She had thought of it, if she had thought of it at all, as justice, as the great wheel of the world turning at last to set its weight where the weight was owed. But sitting across the desk from him now, watching him absorb the fact that she would walk through the rooms of his humiliation as he had once walked, untouchable, through the rooms of hers, she found that the word justice had grown complicated in her mouth. "I can conduct the inventory," she said, more quietly than she'd intended, without either of us needing to enter that room. His eyes came up to hers. For the space of a breath, something passed between them that neither had permission to feel, a flicker of recognition, of a shared and unspoken knowledge of what had happened under that roof, of what it would cost them both to stand again inside those walls. It was the first thing they had ever shared that was not enmity. Then he closed it off, the way he closed everything off, and the grey came down. "How considerate," he said, and the old edge was in it, but it was blunted now, worn thin as the cuffs of his coat. "Sparing me the scene of the crime, I'm sure the Trust will note your compassion in the file." "I wasn't offering it for the file." "No," he agreed after a moment. "I don't suppose you were." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. They sat with it, the two of them, in the brittle autumn light, and the clock ticked, and neither seemed able to find the next thing to say. It was Hermione who broke it. She reached for the ledger, for the safety of procedure, the one country in which she still felt certain of her footing, and turned it to the page she had marked. "Your declaration," she said. "The open question from last month, the blank entry. I told you to return prepared to answer it." The change in him was immediate. The careful stillness returned, that stillness she had once read as arrogance, and now no longer knew how to read at all. His concealed hand shifted in his pocket. "You did," he said. "Are you prepared?" "No." Just that. No excuse, no evasion, no plea. He met her gaze and gave her the flat refusal like a man laying down a card he knew would cost him the game, and there was something in the steadiness of it that undid her more thoroughly than any amount of pleading could have done. Malfoy. She heard the change in her own voice and could not stop it, the hardness giving way to something that was almost, God help her, gentleness. "I meant what I said. I can hold you in default. I can take Wiltshire. Whatever this is, whatever you're protecting, it isn't worth your ruin. Tell me what you sold, and let me close the entry and be done with it." And for one moment, she was certain of this. She would be certain of it for the rest of her life. He wanted to. She saw it in the way his jaw worked, in the way his breath caught and held, in the way his hidden hand came half out of his pocket, and she glimpsed it before he stopped himself. The fingers wrapped in a strip of linen, a makeshift bandage, dark at the edge with something that had dried. He had hurt himself, or something had hurt him, and he had bound it up in secret and told no one, and he had come here anyway, punctual to the hour, to sit across a desk from the woman who held his life in a ledger and refuse her the one answer that might have saved him. He saw her see it. He pushed the hand back into his pocket, and the shutter came down, complete. "Take Wiltshire, then," he said. His voice was very quiet and very steady, and it did not shake at all. "I told you last month, Granger. Some things aren't yours to have. I meant it then. I mean it now. You can strip me of the roof over my head and the ground under it, and the name I was fool enough to be born to, and I'll sign for every inch of it. But you don't get this. Not this. Not for the whole of the debt and the interest on it besides." He rose. He did it with difficulty, she saw now, a stiffness in the way he came to his feet, favouring the injured hand, and yet he rose with the same unbroken grace, the same maddening refusal to let his body confess what his pride would not. He gathered the worn coat. He turned toward the door. "I'll see you at the house," he said, without looking back. "Next week. Bring your inventory. Count what you like. It was never really mine to keep, any of it. I understood that the day you people came and put your locks on my father's door." A pause, and then, so low she almost missed it. "But I'll thank you not to count the parts of it that bled." And he was gone before she could ask him what he meant. The door drawn shut behind him with that same soft, deliberate care, his uneven footsteps fading down the corridor and out of hearing. And Hermione sat alone in the hard, bright rectangle of autumn light with a ledger open before her, and the blank lines staring up from the page, and her own hand, once again, was not steady, and this time she did not even pretend not to notice, but pressed it flat against the cool wood of the desk, and held it there until the trembling stopped. The manor stood at the end of its long avenue of dead elms, like a thing that had outlived its own meaning. Hermione came to it on foot from the apparition point at the gates. and the gravel was loud under her boots in the stillness of the early morning, and the great wrought-iron peacocks that had once crowned the pillars were gone, sold, she supposed, or seized, melted down for the metal and the meagre sum it fetched. The absence of them was somehow worse than any ruin could have been. The house had been proud once. Now it merely endured, its windows blank, its stones streaked with the grey weep of 3 winters' neglect, and she stood at the foot of the steps and felt the old dread rise in her throat like water. She had not been back since the night they had escaped it. She had thought she was prepared. She had told herself, in the safe, bright rooms of her office, that she was a grown woman now, and a war was over, and a house was only a house. But her body remembered what her mind had filed away, and as she climbed the steps, her arm began, faintly, to ache. The old scar tissue tightening beneath her sleeve, the word she never looked at anymore, pulling at her skin as though the house itself were reading it back to her. The door opened before she reached it. He was waiting in the hall. He had dressed with the same worn precision as always, but there was something different in him this morning, here on his own ground. A wariness, a bracing, the look of a man who has invited a surgeon into his house and knows what the surgeon has come to cut. Behind him, the great hall stretched away into shadow, its chandeliers shrouded in dust sheets, its portraits turned to the wall or gone entirely, the marble floor dull where 1,000 candlelit evenings had once made it shine. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy." Neither of them moved to cross the threshold together. She stepped in on her own, past him, into the cold air of the hall, and it closed around her. The smell of the place, dust and old stone, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the ghost of the beeswax and lavender the house elves had once used to polish everything to a shine. That smell undid her more than the sight of the ruin had. It was the smell of the house as it had been on the night she was dragged across its floor, and for a moment her vision narrowed, and the ache in her arm became a burn, and she had to stop, one hand against the cold panelling, and breathe. He saw. Of course he saw. He saw everything. That was the terrible thing about him. He had spent 11 months learning the small country of her face, just as she had learned his. She waited for him to say something cruel, some remark to remind her whose house this was, some reassertion of the old order. It would almost have been a mercy. It would have given her something to hate. He said nothing, but he moved, a single step, placing himself between her and the arched doorway on the left, the doorway through which she could see, past his shoulder, the pale wall and the tall windows of the drawing-room beyond. He did it without a word, and without meeting her eyes, as though he were merely adjusting his position, as though it meant nothing at all. He put his body between her and the room where his aunt had cut her, and he pretended he had not done it, and Hermione understood that he had been dreading her return to this house, not only for his own sake, but for hers. The knowledge sat strangely in her chest. She did not know what to do with it, so she did what she always did when she did not know what to feel. She reached for the work. "The library," she said. "Show me." He led her up the great staircase and along a gallery hung with the paler rectangles where portraits had once been. And he opened a set of double doors, and the library took her breath away. It was vast. It rose 2 full stories, galleried, the shelves climbing into shadow above the reach of the tall mullioned windows, and it was full, gloriously, impossibly full, of books. Whatever else had been stripped from the house, the collection remained, held in its long limbo of joint lean, and the morning light came slanting through the dusty glass and fell across the spines in bars of gold, and the whole room smelled of leather and vellum and the dry, sweet dust of centuries. It was, she thought, the only room in the house that was still entirely alive. "Oh," she said, before she could stop herself. He glanced at her. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, he did not smile, but the memory of where a smile might once have lived. "Yes," he said quietly, "it does that." They worked. It was slow, painstaking labour, and it filled the hours, and Hermione was grateful for it. Volume by volume they went along the shelves, he lifting each book down, she recording it, the two of them establishing provenance and condition, and whether it might lawfully be sold or must be preserved. He knew the collection intimately. He knew where each book had come from, and who had owned it, and what was wrong with the binding of the third folio, and why the marginalia in the astronomy text were worth more than the text itself. He spoke of the books, the way another man might speak of friends, and as the morning wore on into afternoon, the wariness went out of him, degree by degree, until he was simply a man in a library, handing her the things he loved so that she could take them away. That was the part she had not been prepared for, that he loved them, that every volume she marked for liquidation was a small bereavement he bore without a word, setting it aside on the pile of things to be sold with a care that was almost tender, his fingers lingering a half-second on the spine before he let it go. And she was the one taking them. That was the arrangement. That was the justice of it. She held his life in her ledger, and now she held his beloved books in her cataloguing hand, and every entry she made was a loss she inflicted. And he let her inflict it without complaint, because the debt was owed, and he had long ago stopped pretending otherwise. It should have felt like victory. It had felt, for 11 months across a desk, like the slow, steady satisfaction of a thing set right. It did not feel like that now. It felt like watching someone say goodbye to everything they had, one object at a time, and being the reason for the parting. They reached the far end of the lower gallery as the light began to fail, and there, on a shelf apart from the rest, stood a row of books that did not match the others. They were newer, not old at all, some of them, their bindings plain and modern. She reached for the first of them, and he moved, fast, faster than she had seen him move, and his hand came down over hers on the spine of the book. They both went still. His hand was over hers. She could feel the warmth of it, the unexpected roughness of a palm that had learned, these 3 years, to do work it had never done before. And beneath her fingers, she could feel the linen still wrapped around his, the makeshift bandage dried dark at one edge. Neither of them breathed. The whole vast room seemed to hold its silence around the single point where his skin met hers, and the ache in her arm went quiet, and there was nothing in the world but the warmth of his hand and the sudden roar of her own pulse in her ears. He took his hand away as though the book had burned him. "Not those," he said. His voice had gone rough. Those aren't part of the collection. They're mine. Personal. They've no provenance worth recording. Leave them. She looked at the books. Healing texts she saw now. The plain modern bindings of medical treatises, herbals, volumes on the wasting curses, and the slow poisons and the maladies that magic could not mend. A dozen of them, 24, worn with use, some of them stuck through with slips of parchment marking pages. Not the library of a collector, the library of a man teaching himself, desperately and alone, how to save someone. And on the shelf beside them, a gap, a space where more such books had stood, the dust disturbed, the wood paler where the sun had not reached it for years, and had reached it now because the books that had shielded it were gone, sold. The blank entry, the sum too large to ignore and too small to matter. Effects unlisted, buyer unnamed, purpose left blank. He had sold his rarest treasures, first editions, folios, the things she had watched him part with all day with that lingering half-second of grief. No, no. He had kept those, hadn't he? Fought to keep them under lien. It was these he had sold, the healing books. He had sold the medical texts, the ones he needed, to pay for something he needed more. And he had left the entry blank, because to name it would be to name the thing it was for, and that thing was the one part of his life he would not lay in her ledger for all the debt in the world. She looked up at him. He was standing very still in the failing light, and he had seen her understand, and his face had gone white and defenseless in a way she had never seen it. The shutter that never failed him gone entirely. Nothing left but a man caught in the act of protecting the last thing he had. "Malfoy," she said, very softly. "Who's ill?" For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving in the dead elms outside the tall, dark windows and the settling of the old house around them, and his breath, unsteady now, at last, unsteady. "Finish your inventory, Granger," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, and it did not hold together the way it always held together. "It's getting dark. You'll want to be gone before the house remembers what it is." But he did not move to hand her the next book, and she did not move to record it, and the two of them stood there in the last gold light among the things he loved, and the things he had sold to save someone he loved more, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, and the fresh grief he had thought he'd hidden. And the space between them had become something neither of them had a name for, and neither of them stepped back from it. She did not finish the inventory that night. She told herself she would return to it, that the catalogue was unfinished, and the trust would require it, and there was nothing improper in coming back to a house she was lawfully entitled to audit. But when she apparated home to her small flat and stood in her own kitchen with the kettle forgotten in her hand, it was not the unrecorded shelves she thought of. It was the gap in the dust, the plain modern spines. His hand coming down over hers, fast, faster than pride should have allowed, to keep her from the one shelf in all that vast collection that could tell her the truth. Who's ill? She had asked it, and he had not answered, and the not answering had been an answer all its own. She should have let it go. She was his creditor, not his confessor. The healing books were, as he'd said, his own. No provenance, no claim upon them, nothing the trust could touch. She had every professional reason to close the matter, mark the entry resolved, and never think of it again. Instead, she went, the next morning, to the records office. It was not difficult. That was the shameful part, how easily it came apart once she pulled the first thread. The Malfoy estate was the most heavily documented private fortune in the country. Every transaction of the last 3 years had passed under the trust's eye, and Hermione had the clearance to read all of it. She pulled the vault records. She pulled the household accounts. She pulled the register of St. Mungo's admissions, which she had no business pulling at all, and which she pulled anyway and hated herself for, and pulled. And there it was, not under his name, under his mother's, Narcissa Malfoy, admitted, then discharged at family's request, ongoing treatment, private, at residence, diagnosis, and then a string of healer's notation she had to look up, term by term, in the medical lexicon on her own shelf, and when she had translated it all into plain words, she sat very still at her kitchen table with the papers spread before her, and understood. A wasting curse, old and slow, and of a kind the healers could ease but not cure. The sort of dark, patient magic that unspooled a person thread by thread over years, that the great teaching hospital could do little for beyond palliation, and that the great teaching hospital, in any case, charged for. The Malfoy name no longer opened the doors it once had. The Malfoy vault no longer paid the fees it once could. St. Mungo's had done what it would do for the wife of a convicted Death Eater, whose fortune belonged, now, to the very fund that was rebuilding the world her family had helped to break. And then it had discharged her to be cared for at home. At home. In that vast cold house with the dust sheets over the chandeliers and the portraits stripped from the walls. Cared for by whom? There were no house elves left. They had been freed or seized or had simply gone. There was no fortune to hire healers. There was only Draco, she understood. Draco, who had sold his rarest books not to hide wealth from her, but to buy the potions and the pain drafts and the private consultations the trust's fees left him no money for. Draco, who had taught himself from those plain modern volumes how to brew what he could not afford to buy. Draco, whose hand she had seen wrapped in a strip of bloodied linen, because a man brewing dark curse antidotes alone in a ruined still-room would burn himself, would cut himself, would bleed and bind it up and tell no one, and come to her office punctual to the hour and refuse her every question. Some things aren't yours to have. I'll thank you not to count the parts of it that bled. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat in her cold kitchen for a long time. She had built 11 months on a certainty. She had told herself, and it had been true, that was the unbearable thing. It had all been true, that the debt was owed, that the reckoning was just, that the great wheel of the world was turning at last to set its weight where the weight belonged. She had permitted herself the clean, sustaining pleasure of being right, of holding in her ledger the life of the family whose house had cut a word into her arm. And every word of it had been justice. And underneath the justice, unnoticed, a man had been selling his books to keep his mother alive. Both things were true. That was what she could not make sit still. The debt was just, and he was drowning. The reckoning was owed, and he was paying it in a coin she had never thought to count. She had not been wrong. She had simply not been looking at the whole of it. And now that she had seen the whole of it, she could not unsee it. And the pleasure of being right had curdled into something that tasted like shame. She did not sleep. When the first working day of the next month came, she had not decided what she would do. She had rehearsed nothing. She sat at her desk in the office, with the hard, clear light coming through the tall window and the ledger open before her, and the clock struck 9, and the door opened, and he came in. He looked worse. That was the first thing, the only thing she could see. Whatever the month had taken from him, it had taken a great deal. The greyness under his eyes had deepened to bruise. He moved like a man carrying something heavy across a long distance, and when he sat, he did it slowly, and this time he could not entirely hide the way his breath caught on the way down, the small involuntary sound of a body worn past its own endurance. The right hand was bandaged again, a fresh strip of linen, cleaner than the last, but a bandage still. He had been up all night, she thought, perhaps many nights, brewing or sitting with her, or both. And he had risen from that and put on his worn coat and come across the country to sit in front of the woman who held his ruin in a book, because the law required it, and he would not give the law the satisfaction of finding him wanting. "Granger," he said. His voice was thin. "Malfoy." She looked at him. She looked at him properly, for perhaps the first time in 11 months. Not as the creditor looking at the debtor, not as the wronged looking at the guilty, but as one exhausted person looking at another and seeing, at last, the exhaustion. And she made a decision she had not known she was going to make until the words were already leaving her. "Your mother," she said. "How is she?" He went absolutely still. It was not the stillness she knew, not the smooth, arrogant shudder, not the flat, grey resolve. It was the stillness of a man who has been struck somewhere he did not know he could be struck, who is holding himself motionless because to move even slightly would be to come apart. The colour drained from his face. His bandaged hand closed on the arm of the chair, the knuckles going white, the fresh linen pulling tight. "What did you say?" he said, very quietly, very carefully. "I asked how your mother is." She kept her voice gentle and level, and she did not look away from him, though every instinct told her to give him the mercy of her averted eyes. "I know she's ill, Malfoy. I know it's a wasting curse, and St. Mungo's discharged her, and there's no one at the house to care for her but you. I know that's what the blank entry was. You sold the healing books to pay for what the trust's fees leave you nothing to pay for. I know you've been brewing for her yourself, alone, because you can't afford a healer, and I know that's how you keep cutting your hands." She drew a breath. "I know all of it. I found it. I had no right to look, and I looked, and I found it. So don't tell me some things aren't mine to have. It's too late for that. I already have it. The question is only what I do with it now." For a moment, he said nothing at all, and then something happened that she had never seen and would never forget. The shutter did not come down. He tried. She watched him try, watched him reach for the smooth, cold composure that had carried him through 11 months of humiliation, the armour that had let him sign for the loss of everything without once letting her see it, cost him. He reached for it, and it was not there. It had worn through at last, the way the cuffs of his coat had worn through, the way the man himself had worn through, and there was nothing left to hide behind. His face crumpled, only for a second, only for the space of a single ragged breath before he mastered it. But she saw it. She saw the whole of it, the terror and the exhaustion and the grief and the sheer bottomless loneliness of a man who had been fighting to save his mother entirely alone in a cold and ruined house, giving up everything he had, one book at a time, and telling no one, and expecting no help, and receiving none. "Don't," he said. His voice broke on the word, and he hated it breaking. She could see him hate it. Don't pity me, Granger. Not you. I can stand anything but that. You can take Wiltshire and the books and the roof and the name, and I'll stand it. But if you sit there and pity me, I swear to God I'll—" He stopped. His hand had come up to his face, the bandaged one, pressing hard against his mouth, as though he could physically force the words back in, and his shoulders had begun, very slightly, to shake. And he was fighting it with everything he had left, and he was losing. Hermione rose from behind the desk. She did not decide to. The desk had been the whole architecture of their world, the wide, dark barrier of it, the ledger upon it, the geometry that made her the creditor and him the debtor, and kept them always on opposite shores of it. She had never once in 11 months come out from behind it. And now she came out from behind it without a thought, drawn across the room by something older than procedure and stronger than justice. And she crossed the space that had always separated them, and she stopped in front of his chair. "It isn't pity," she said. He would not look up at her. His hand was still pressed to his mouth, his eyes shut, his whole body rigid with the effort of holding himself together in front of her. Malfoy. Draco. His given name in her mouth stopped his breath. She felt it stop. "Look at me. It isn't pity." And when he finally lifted his face to hers, wrecked and defenseless and unbearably young in the hard, clear light, she did the only thing that made any sense at all. The thing that made no sense. The thing that broke every rule of the ledger and the trust and the 11 months and the war itself. She reached out, slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and she laid her hand against the side of his face, over the fresh bandage, over the exhaustion and the grief, and she held it there, and she did not let go. He did not pull away. That was the thing she would remember afterward, that for one long suspended moment he did not move at all, did not flinch from her hand or turn his wrecked face aside, but simply let her hold it, the warmth of her palm against the fever warmth of his skin, his breath uneven under her touch. His eyes closed. Something in him that had been clenched for 3 years loosened by a single degree, and she felt it loosen, felt the minute surrender of a man setting down for one instant a weight he had carried entirely alone. Then he caught himself. He drew back, not roughly, not with the old venom, but with a kind of terrible gentleness, turning his face out of her hand, as though the kindness of it were more than he could bear. "You should go," he said. His voice had steadied, but only barely. "It's late. The office will be closing." It was not late. It was mid-morning. They both knew it. But she understood what he was asking, that she leave him the tatters of his composure, that she not stay to watch him fail to hold himself together, and she almost granted it. She had her hand halfway back to her side, and then the window went dark. It happened all at once, the way autumn storms come down over that part of the country. A sudden lowering of the light, the hard, clear morning swallowed in an instant by cloud the colour of a bruise. And then the rain, not the patient drumming of before, but a violent silver sheeting that flung itself against the tall glass with a sound like gravel thrown by the handful. The lamps guttered. Somewhere in the building, a ward hummed and settled. The temperature dropped, and the storm closed over the ministry annex like a hand closing over a flame. Hermione crossed to the window. The street below had vanished into grey. The apparition point at the corner, she could see the wrought iron arch that marked it, was wreathed in the particular shimmer that meant the wards had thrown up their storm protocol, sealing the point against the wild magic that a tempest of this violence could carry. No one would be apparating in or out until it passed. "We're closed in," she said. "Storm wards. You can't apparate, and neither can I, not until it lifts." She turned back to him. He had risen from the chair, slowly, one hand braced on its arm, and he stood in the grey stormlight with the rain roaring against the glass behind her. And for a moment neither of them said anything, because the thing that had always structured their meetings, the hour of it, the ledger, the desk, the clean departure at the end, all of it had been suspended. They were simply two people caught together in a room while the sky came apart outside, and there was no procedure for that. There was no procedure for any of it anymore. "How long?" he said. "An hour, perhaps more. These things blow through, but the wards don't lift until the wild magic's cleared." She hesitated. "Sit down, Malfoy, before you fall down." He almost argued. She saw the reflex of it, and then something went out of him. The fight, perhaps, or simply the strength to keep pretending. And he sat, heavily this time, without grace, and the abandonment of the grace told her more than anything else could have how far past his own endurance he had gone. She did not go back behind the desk. She could have. It would have been the safe thing, the professional thing, to retreat to her own side of the barrier and wait out the storm with the ledger between them and the roles restored. Instead, she drew the second chair, the plain wooden one that stood by the wall, that no debtor had ever used, because debtors did not sit beside her, and she set it near his, not across from him, but beside him, both of them facing the storm-dark window, and she sat down in it. For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain filled the room. It was strange sitting beside him, not opposite, not in judgment, but shoulder to shoulder in the failing light, watching the water run down the glass. She had never once in 11 months been beside him. The whole of their acquaintance had been conducted across a distance she had built and maintained and believed in. And now the distance was simply gone, dissolved by a storm, and in its absence she found she did not know how to be with him, and neither, it seemed, did he. It was he who broke the silence, and when he did, it was so quiet she almost lost it under the rain. "She was beautiful," he said. "My mother. You wouldn't know it now. The curse. It takes the beauty first. That's the cruelty of it, or one of them. She was the most beautiful woman in any room she ever entered, and she knew it. And now she can't lift her own hand to her hair, and she knows that too." He was not looking at Hermione. He was looking at the rain. "She saved your life, you know. That night, at the final battle, she lied to the Dark Lord's face, told him Potter was dead when she just felt his heart beating, because she wanted to get into the castle to find me. She gambled everything, her life and worse than her life, on the chance of reaching her son. And she reached me, and we lived. His jaw tightened. And this is what she gets: to be eaten alive slowly in a cold house by a curse no one will pay to lift, tended by a son who isn't healer enough to save her and too poor to hire one who is. Hermione sat very still. "I'm not telling you for pity," he went on before she could speak. "I told you, I can't stand your pity. I'm telling you because you found it out anyway, and I'd rather you have it whole than in pieces. And because—" He stopped. His hands, the bandaged one and the bare one, had come together in his lap, and he was turning the signet ring on his finger, round and round, the serpent crest catching the grey light. "Because you're the only person I've spoken to in 3 months who wasn't dying, and the storm won't let you leave. And I find I'm too tired to keep pretending I don't mind the silence of that house." She looked at him, at the exhaustion, at the ring turning and turning, at the profile lit grey by the storm, and something in her chest ached with a sweetness that was almost pain. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. "Not this month. 11 months ago. The first time you sat across that desk. You could have told the trust your mother was ill. There are provisions, hardship relief, medical deferment. I could have reduced the fees. I could have—" She heard her own voice and stopped, because she understood, even as she said it, why he had not. "You wouldn't take it. From me. That's why. You'd rather she suffer than let me be the one to help her." "No," he said, and the word was sharp, immediate, and he turned to look at her for the first time since the storm broke. "No, not that. Never that. I'd take help for her from the devil himself, Granger. I'd have crawled to you on my knees if crawling would have bought her a single easy night." His voice roughened. "I didn't tell you, because if I'd told you, you'd have had this too. My mother. The last thing. You already held everything else, the house, the money, the name, my whole ruined life in your book. And I could stand you holding all of it, because none of it mattered. But her. If I gave you her, if I made her a line in your ledger, a hardship application, a case to be assessed, then you'd hold the only thing left that I couldn't stand to lose. And I couldn't. I couldn't hand you that too. Not you. Not after—" He stopped, but she knew the shape of what he had not said. "Not after what this house did to you. Not after I stood by and let it. What right had I to ask you, of all people, to save the woman whose sister carved that word into your arm?" The rain roared on, and Hermione understood, at last and completely, the whole of what she had misjudged. It had never been arrogance. It had never been contempt. It had been shame. A shame so total that he would rather lose everything, would rather watch his mother waste in a cold house than lay one more claim upon the person his family had wronged most. His silence had not been the silence of a man refusing to bend. It had been the silence of a man who did not believe he had the right to ask. She reached out. She did not touch his face this time. She laid her hand over his hands, over the bare one and the bandaged one both, over the ring he was turning and turning, and she stilled them. "Listen to me," she said. "I held your life in that ledger for 11 months, and I did it gladly, and I told myself it was justice, and it was justice. I won't take that back, not any of it, because it was true. What your family did was owed for, and someone had to hold the account, and I don't regret being the one who did." Her fingers tightened over his. "But I never once, in all those months, held it wanting you to break. I wanted the debt paid. I never wanted you destroyed. And I did not know, I swear to you, I did not know, that while I sat there being right, you were dying by inches to keep me from finding out how much it cost. If I had known, you couldn't have known. I made certain of it." "If I had known," she said again, fierce now, "I would not have let you carry it alone. Justice doesn't require that, Draco. It never required that. You made it require that. You decided you deserved to suffer, and you built the suffering yourself, alone, in the dark, and you called it pride, but it wasn't pride." She was very close to him now. She had leaned in without knowing it, and the stormlight was on both their faces, and the rain was the only sound in the world. "It was penance. You've been doing penance, and no one sentenced you to it but yourself." He stared at her. His hands had gone still under hers. His breath came shallow and fast, and his grey eyes searched her face as though he were reading something written there in a language he had forgotten he knew. And the space between them had grown very small, and neither of them moved to make it larger. Outside, the storm reached its height and began, unnoticed by either of them, at last to break. The storm passed, and the wards lifted, and she went home. But something had come loose in her that would not settle back into its place. She lay awake that night and the next, and the thing that kept her from sleep was not his grief, though the grief had lodged in her like a splinter she could not work free. It was the smaller, sharper realization that had come to her somewhere in the grey hours by that storm-dark window, that when she had leaned toward him, close enough to feel the warmth coming off his skin, close enough to see the stormlight caught in his lashes, she had not wanted to lean away. That, when she had laid her hand over his and felt his breath go shallow, her own had gone shallow too. That she had sat beside Draco Malfoy in a sealed room while the sky came apart, and she had felt, beneath the pity and the shame and the slow, terrible rearrangement of everything she had believed about him, the unmistakable pull of something she had no permission to feel. She was his creditor. She held his life in a ledger. There was no arrangement of power on earth more absolute, more one-sided than the one that bound the two of them. And she had felt her heart turn over in her chest at the sight of him wrecked and defenseless in a wooden chair. And that was not merely improper. It was a kind of corruption. It was the exact thing the whole edifice of the trust was built to prevent. She understood the danger of it with a clarity that frightened her. A woman who holds power over a man and comes to want him. She is the most dangerous kind of person in any story. Every mercy she extends becomes suspect. Every leniency, every reduction, every kindness. Is it justice, or is it desire buying itself a clear conscience? She could not soften his terms without asking herself whether she was softening them because they ought to be softened, or because she wanted him to look at her the way he had looked at her in the stormlight. She could not trust her own judgment anymore. She had spent 11 months certain that her power over him was clean, because her feeling toward him was clean. Clean loathing, clean justice, no muddying want. and now the want was there, and it fouled everything it touched. She could not be his creditor and want him. It was that simple and that impossible. To hold his life in her hands and to feel her pulse quicken when he entered the room, she could not do both and remain a person she was willing to be. So, she would withdraw. She would recuse herself from his case, hand the file to another administrator, restore the clean distance her feeling had destroyed. It was the honest thing. It was the only honest thing. She went to the Trust's director on a wet Thursday and asked to be relieved of the Malfoy account. On what grounds? The director asked. He was an old man, careful and kind, who had rebuilt half of Diagon Alley from the fund's disbursements, and who did not do anything without a reason recorded in triplicate. And Hermione opened her mouth to say conflict of interest, and stopped. Because to recuse herself, she would have to state a cause, and any cause she could state would open the file. Another administrator would take up the account, and the first thing that administrator would do would be to review the outstanding matters. And the first outstanding matter was the blank entry, the unexplained sale, the unresolved discrepancy that she had marked open question in her own hand 11 weeks ago and never closed. A new administrator, cold to the case, unmoved by anything but the ledger, would pull the thread exactly as she had pulled it, would find Narcissa, would find the wasting curse, the private treatment, the healing books sold to pay for it, and would enter it all into the record, because that administrator would have no reason not to, would in fact be obligated to, because an undeclared medical liability affected the debtor's capacity to pay, and therefore the Trust's schedule of recovery. Narcissa would become a line in the ledger, the one thing Draco had sold his soul by inches to prevent, the making of his dying mother into an asset, a liability, a case to be assessed by strangers. She would cause it herself the instant she stepped away. Her recusal, meant to protect him from her compromised judgment, would deliver him into hands that had no judgment to compromise at all. Hands that would do to Narcissa exactly what he could not bear. She stood in the director's office with the rain on the window and understood the trap she was in. She could not stay on the case without abusing the power her feeling had corrupted. And she could not leave it without exposing the man she had come to. She made herself finish the thought, the man she had come to care for, to the very fate he had ruined himself to prevent. "Granger," the director said. "On what grounds?" "Nothing," she heard herself say. "I misspoke. The account is difficult, that's all. The debtor is uncooperative. I wanted to complain, not to withdraw." She managed something that resembled a smile. "Forget I asked." She went back to her office and sat down behind the desk that had been the whole architecture of her authority. And she put her head in her hands, and she stayed like that for a long time. There was no clean path. That was the thing she had to sit with. For 11 months, she had lived inside a story where the line between right and wrong ran straight and bright as a wand's core, where she stood on the side of justice and he stood on the side of the debt, and the whole shape of it was simple, and that story was gone. In its place was this: a man who deserved his ruin and did not deserve to lose his mother, a power she wielded justly and could no longer trust herself to wield, a feeling she had no right to and could not put down. Every direction she turned led into wrong. She could betray her office, Or she could betray him, or she could go on as she was, holding his life in a book while her heart turned traitor in her chest, and pretend that the pretending was not itself a kind of lie. She was still sitting there when the month turned and the first working day came again, and she had decided nothing, resolved nothing, and the clock struck 9, and the door opened, and he came in. He was steadier. That was the first thing she noticed, that whatever the storm had loosened between them, it had done him some good. There was more colour in his face, and he moved without the careful favouring of pain. Something had eased. And she realised, with a small, painful lurch, that it was probably the simple fact of having been seen, that for 3 years he had carried the whole of it in silence, and for 1 hour in a sealed room he had set it down in front of another human being, and even that much had lightened him. She had done that, and she could not do it again, because to be the thing that eased him was to be exactly the thing she could not trust herself to be. "Granger," he said. There was something new in the way he said it. Not warmth, quite, but not the old flat enmity either. A wariness, but a different wariness. The wariness of a man who has shown someone the inside of himself and does not yet know what they mean to do with it. Malfoy. She could not quite meet his eyes. "Sit." He sat, and she reached for the ledger, for the ritual, for the safe, familiar procedure that had structured every one of their meetings. And she found, when she opened it, that she could not do it. She could not sit across this desk and take his declaration and hold his life in her hand, not now, not knowing what she knew and feeling what she felt. Her hands would not turn the page. The whole apparatus of it had become unbearable. And he saw. Of course he saw. He had spent 11 months learning her, and he saw the moment she faltered, saw her hand stall on the ledger, saw whatever was written on her face that she could not keep from being written there. "Granger," he said slowly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." The lie came out thin. "Your declaration. Give me your declaration." He did not move to take it from his coat. He sat very still, watching her, and she felt the attention of him, like heat, like the pressure that builds before a storm breaks. And she kept her eyes on the ledger and would not look up, because she knew that if she looked up, he would read the whole of it in her face. The wanting, the recusal she couldn't make, the trap, all of it. And once he read it, there would be no unreading it. "Look at me," he said quietly. "Your declaration, Malfoy." Hermione, her given name. He had never once used it. She had used his in the storm, but he had never used hers, and the sound of it in his low voice went through her like current through wire, and her head came up before she could stop it, and she looked at him, and he saw. She watched him see it. She watched the understanding move across his face, the slow dawning comprehension of what she had not said and could not say, the thing she had come to feel and had no right to feel. And his own expression changed as he read it, wariness giving way to something that stopped his breath, something that was half wonder and half a kind of dread, because he understood the danger of it as immediately and completely as she had. Understood what it meant that the woman who held his life had come to want him, and understood that it changed everything, and could be permitted to change nothing, all in the same instant. For a long moment, neither of them breathed. The ledger lay open between them. The rain ticked against the glass. And the whole ruined architecture of their arrangement, the debt and the power and the 11 months of clean, sustaining enmity, hung suspended in the air between his eyes and hers, waiting to see which of them would be the first to say the thing that could not be unsaid. It was Draco who moved first, and what he did was the last thing she expected. He stood. He rose from the chair in one deliberate motion, and he reached into his coat, and he drew out not the folded declaration, but something else. A second parchment, heavier, sealed with a blot of plain black wax that bore no crest, because he no longer had a crest he was permitted to press into wax. He set it on the desk between them, on top of the open ledger, and he stepped back from it. "What is this?" she said. "A request for the full and immediate calling of the debt." His voice was very level. All of it, every galleon outstanding, every deferred payment, the whole balance due at once. "I'm asking the trust to demand it in full this quarter, and to move against the estate for the remainder when I can't pay, which will be at once, because I can't pay 100th of it." He was watching her, and his face had gone carefully, deliberately blank. "I'm asking you to finish it, Granger. Take Wiltshire. Take the library. Take the last of the vault. Bankrupt me completely and close the account and be done. I've signed it. It only wants your countersignature to begin." She stared at the parchment. She stared at him. "You'll lose everything," she said. "The house, your mother's home. You'll have nowhere to—" "I know what I'll lose." "Then why?" "Because I saw your face just now." He said it quietly, and it landed like a blow, because it was true, and they both knew it was true. "I saw what you couldn't say, and I've been sitting here for 3 minutes doing the arithmetic of it, and it comes out the same every way I add it. You feel something for me. God knows why, God knows how, but you do. I watched it happen in your eyes, and you can't hide it. You never could hide anything. It's the one thing about you that hasn't changed since you were 12 years old with your hand in the air." His jaw worked. "And that means you can't be my creditor anymore. Not honestly. You know it, and I know it. Every kindness you do me from here on is poisoned. You'll never know if you're being just or being soft, and neither will I, and neither will anyone who ever looks at this file. The whole thing you built, the whole clean, righteous ledger you were so proud of, it's finished the moment you feel anything for me but justice. That doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself to—" "Yes, it does." He leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk, and there was something fierce in him now, something that had burned through the exhaustion. "Don't you see? It's the only clean thing left. If you call the debt in full, all of it, the maximum, the harshest possible reckoning, then no one can ever say you went soft on me. No one can ever say the mudblood on the Malfoy account let her heart buy the murderer's son an easy ruin. You'll have taken everything. That's not corruption. That's the opposite of corruption. That's you being harder on me than any cold stranger would have dared, precisely because you feel something and you refuse to let it show as mercy." His voice dropped. "Let me give you that. Let me be the thing that keeps you clean. I've got nothing else left to give you, Granger. Let me at least give you the one gift that costs me everything, which is the only kind of gift I've ever understood how to make." She understood then the whole terrible shape of what he was doing. He would rather be ruined fairly than saved by feeling. He would rather she take everything he had than take one galleon less than justice, because to take less would be to admit the feeling, and to admit the feeling would be to expose her to the trust, to the world, to the sneering judgment of everyone who would say the war heroine had fallen for the Death Eater and let him off light. He was offering to be destroyed in order to protect her from the accusation of having spared him. It was the most Malfoy thing she had ever seen, and it was the least Malfoy thing she had ever seen, both at once, and it broke something in her chest to watch him do it. "No," she said. "Hermione, no." She was on her feet now, too, and her voice had risen, and she did not care. "You listen to me. You've spent 3 years deciding what you deserve. You decided you deserved to lose the house, and you lost it. You decided you deserved to watch your mother die in the cold, and you nearly have. You decided your penance, and you've been paying it in your own blood in a ruined still room every night for 3 years. And now you've decided you deserve to be bankrupted to the last nut, so that I can stay clean. And I am done. Do you hear me? I am done watching you appoint yourself judge and executioner of your own life, while everyone who might have loved you stands outside the door you locked." The word loved was out before she could stop it. It hung in the air. They both heard it. His face changed. Whatever armor he had left, that word went through it. "Don't," he said hoarsely. "Don't say that. You can't say that. It isn't. You can't want it to be true. It would ruin you. It would ruin everything you—" "I know what it would ruin." She came around the desk. She was doing the thing she had sworn not to do, crossing the barrier, closing the distance. But the barrier had been a fiction for weeks now, and they both knew it. And she was tired, so tired, of pretending the desk still meant anything. "I've thought about nothing else for a month. I went to the director, Draco. I asked to be taken off your case. Do you know why I couldn't do it? Because the moment I recused myself, someone else would open your file, and they'd pull the same thread I pulled, and they'd find your mother, and they'd put her in the ledger, a liability, an asset, a case to assess. The one thing you sold everything to prevent. My leaving would cause it, so I couldn't leave. And I can't stay, not honestly, not feeling what I feel. I'm caught, do you understand? There's no clean path. You want to give me one by letting me destroy you, and I won't take it. Because a clean conscience bought with your ruin isn't clean, it's just cruelty with good paperwork." They were very close now. The parchment with its plain black seal lay forgotten on the desk beside them. His breath was uneven, so was hers. "Then what?" he said, very low. "If not that, what's left? You've said it yourself. There's no clean path. Every road is wrong. So which wrong do we choose, Granger? Because I've made my choice. I'd rather lose everything I own than be the thing that makes you a liar. I'd rather be honestly ruined than dishonestly saved. That's the only road I can walk and still look at myself." His grey eyes searched her face. "What road can you walk?" And Hermione, who had spent a month finding no answer, found one now. Not because it was easy, but because he was standing close enough that she could see the exhaustion and the terror and the fierce, doomed generosity of him all at once. And because she was, at bottom, a person who had never in her life met a trap she would consent to lose to. "There's a third road," she said slowly. I've been so busy choosing between betraying my office and betraying you that I never looked for it. But it's there. It's been there the whole time. She caught his wrist, the bandaged one, and held it. The statute, the hardship provisions. I told you there was relief for medical liability, and you wouldn't take it from me because you couldn't stand to make your mother a line in my ledger. But it doesn't have to be my ledger. That's the thing I missed. I recuse myself from your case. I take myself off it entirely, honestly, on grounds of conflict. And at the same time, I file the hardship application on your mother's behalf, as her advocate, not as your creditor. A different office assesses it. A different administrator holds your account. I never touch your debt again. And Narcissa gets the medical deferment she should have had 3 years ago, assessed by someone with no feeling in it either way, which means no one can ever say it was bought soft. She was gripping his wrist hard now. I don't spare you the debt, Draco. You'll still owe every galleon. You'll still pay it for years, honestly, to a creditor who isn't me. But your mother gets cared for, and I get to feel what I feel without it corrupting a single line of your account, because your account will no longer be mine. Do you understand? That's the clean path. Not you destroyed, not me a liar. You free of me as your creditor, so that I can be something else to you instead. He had gone completely still. Something else, he repeated. Something else. She was aware of how close they stood, of the warmth of him, of the roaring quiet in the room. I don't know what yet. I don't know what we'd be, with the ledger gone and the desk gone, and 11 months of me holding your life in my hands set down at last. I don't know if we'd survive knowing each other without it. But I know I'd rather find out than keep standing on opposite shores of a debt, pretending I don't. She stopped. He was looking at her mouth. She had run out of words, or the words had run out of her, and the last of the distance between them had thinned to nothing, and his hand, the bare one, had come up, slowly, giving her every chance to step back as she had once given him. And she did not step back, and his fingers touched the side of her face, where she had once touched his, and the whole ruined weight of everything they had been to each other hung trembling in the half-inch of air that was all that remained between them. Neither of them closed the half-inch. They stood on the very edge of it, his fingers against her cheek. Her breath caught somewhere below her ribs, and the almost of it was so complete, so absolute, that to move even the smallest fraction would have been to cross out of one life and into another. And it was that, the enormity of it, that stopped them both. Because a kiss, now, here, over the open ledger, with the parchment of his ruin still sealed on the desk beside them, would be a kiss that meant she had fallen for the man whose account she held. It would be the very thing that could never be untangled from the power, the exact confusion she had spent a month trying to escape. If they crossed the line now, they would carry the desk into it with them, and the debt and the 11 months, and it would poison whatever grew from it. She understood this, and she watched him understand it too, and it was he who drew back first. A slow, aching withdrawal, his hand leaving her face by degrees, the space opening again between them like a wound reopening. "Not like this," he said. His voice was rough. "Not with the ledger still open, not while I still owe you." He stepped back, One full step, and she felt the cold rush in to fill the place where his warmth had been. If it's real, if you mean it, this third road, then it has to be real all the way down. You take yourself off my account. You file for my mother. The debt goes to someone who isn't you. And when there's no ledger between us, when you don't hold one single thing over my life anymore, when I'm nothing to you but a man who owes his money to a stranger's office. He stopped. His jaw worked. Then, if you still want to, you can touch my face like that again, and I won't step back. But not now. Not while you could still ruin me with a signature. I won't have it said, and I won't have it be true, that I kissed my way to a lighter debt. Not with you. You're the one person in the world I need to have earned honestly, or not at all. It was, she thought, the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever refused her. And it was exactly right, and she loved him for it. She let herself think the word, quietly, privately, for the first time without flinching from it. She loved him for being, at the last, more scrupulous about the power between them than she had managed to be. "All right," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Then that's how we do it. Cleanly, all the way down." She did it that week. She went to the director on Monday and recused herself from the Malfoy account, honestly, on grounds of conflict of interest, stating for the record only that her judgment could no longer be relied upon to be impartial, which was true, and which cost her something to write, because it was the closest thing to a confession she had ever put in an official hand. The director read it and looked at her for a long moment over his spectacles, and did not ask the question he plainly wanted to ask, and reassigned the file to a cold, careful administrator named Pruitt, who cared for nothing but the accuracy of columns. And the same day, in the same hour, before Pruitt could pull a single thread, Hermione filed the hardship application on Narcissa Malfoy's behalf. Not as creditor, not as auditor, but as legal advocate, a role the statute permitted to any qualified party willing to stand for a debtor's dependent. She built the case in a single sleepless night. She marshalled the St. Mungo's records she had once been ashamed of pulling, and was now grateful to have pulled. She cited the provisions, the precedents, the obscure clause about incurable maladies that no one had invoked in a decade. She made it airtight. She made it so complete that Pruitt, receiving it, could do nothing but grant the medical deferment, because to deny it would have been to defy the plain letter of the law, and Pruitt cared for nothing but the letter of the law. Narcissa Malfoy was granted a healer, a real one, from St. Mungo's, paid for out of the hardship fund, sent to the manor 3 times a week to do what Draco had been trying and failing to do alone in his ruined still-room with his self-taught hands. The curse could not be lifted. Hermione had never pretended it could. But it could be eased, and it was eased. And for the first time in 3 years, the burden of it did not rest entirely on the shoulders of one exhausted man. She learned all this second-hand through the dry official channels, because she was no longer permitted any contact with the Malfoy account, or by the strict letter of the recusal with Draco himself while the reassignment settled. So she did not see him. For 6 weeks, she did not see him. The first working day of the month came and went, and she did not sit behind her desk at 9 o'clock, because it was no longer her desk that he came to. He reported now to Pruitt in a different office, on a different corridor, and Hermione sat in her own room and listened to the clock cough its small bronze cough and strike the hour, and felt the absence of him like a missing tooth her tongue kept returning to. It was the strangest grief. She had wanted him gone from her ledger. She had engineered it, fought for it, built the airtight case that severed his life from her hand at last. And now that it was done, now that she held no power over him whatsoever, she found that the power had been the only thing that guaranteed she would see him, and without it there was nothing. No appointment, no obligation, no first Tuesday of the month. Nothing to bring him across the country to her door. She had freed them both from the desk, and in freeing them, she had removed the one structure that had ever put them in the same room. He might simply never come. Why would he? The debt was Pruitt's now. The mother was cared for. There was no reason on earth for Draco Malfoy to seek out the woman who had spent 11 months auditing his ruin, except one. And that one reason was a thing he had said he would only act on when there was nothing left between them but the wanting. And now that there was nothing left but the wanting, the silence stretched and stretched, and she began to be afraid that the wanting had not been enough, or had not been real, or had been only the strange intimacy of the storm and the ledger, and would not survive their absence. 6 weeks. The autumn hardened into the first true cold of winter. The rain turned to something colder. And then, on a grey afternoon in the second week of December, with the light already failing at 3:30, and frost feathering the corners of the tall office window, there came a knock at her door. Not the 9 o'clock knock, not the punctual, obligatory arrival of a debtor to his creditor. A knock at an odd hour, tentative, from someone who had no appointment and no right to one and had come anyway. She knew, before she opened it, who it was. She knew it in her body before she knew it in her mind. The way the air of the room seemed to change, the way her own pulse leapt without instruction. She rose from the desk. She crossed the room. Her hand was not steady on the latch, and she did not pretend otherwise. She opened the door. He stood in the corridor in his worn coat, and there was frost in his pale hair from the cold outside, and he looked better. That was the first thing, the thing that closed her throat. He looked better. The bruised exhaustion was gone from beneath his eyes. He stood straight, without the careful favouring of hidden pain. His hands were bare, both of them, no bandage, healed. Someone else was doing the brewing now, or brewing it with him, and the weight he had carried alone for 3 years had been, at last, set down. He looked like a man who had begun, however slowly, to come back to life. And he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in the whole of their acquaintance, because in the whole of their acquaintance there had always been a ledger between them, and now there was none. And without it, his face was simply nakedly open, and what was open on it was hope and terror, and the thing that had been growing in the silence between them for 6 weeks and 11 months. And she understood now, perhaps longer than either of them would ever be able to say. "Granger," he said. And then, quietly, correcting himself, giving her the name he had only used twice, and both times like a man handling something that might break. "Hermione." "You came," she said. It was not what she had meant to say. It was only the truth, the plain, astonished truth falling out of her. "I owe you nothing," he said. His voice was low and unsteady. "Do you understand what I'm telling you? I checked. I made Pruitt confirm it in writing. You hold nothing of mine. Not the debt, not the account, not one galleon or one book or 1 inch of Wiltshire. There is no power left between us. You could not ruin me now if you tried. You've no more authority over my life than any stranger in the street." He drew a breath, and it shook. "Which means, when I tell you that I have thought of nothing but you for 6 weeks, when I tell you that the silence of that house has become unbearable to me for an entirely new reason, which is that you are not in it, when I tell you that I came here with no appointment and no debt and no excuse, only because I could not make myself stay away 1 more day, there is nothing beneath it, no account I'm trying to soften, no mercy I'm angling for. There's nothing left for me to want from you but you." His eyes held hers. "You said once that you didn't know what we'd be with the ledger gone. I've come to find out if you still want to." And Hermione Granger, who had held this man's life in her hands for 11 months and had at last deliberately given every scrap of that power away for exactly this moment, reached out and took him by the frost-cold lapel of his worn coat and drew him in across the threshold, out of the corridor and into the room and into the last of the failing winter light. She drew him in and she closed the door behind him, and for a moment they simply stood there in the failing light, with her hands still fisted in his lapel, the two of them close enough now that there was no ledger and no desk and no half-inch of protective air, only the space that 2 people occupy when they have finally stopped pretending there is any reason to stand apart. "I want to," she said. Her voice was low and certain, and it did not shake now, though everything else in her did. "That's what I've been trying to tell you, in the storm and across the desk, and every day of these 6 weeks that you weren't here. I want to find out what we are. I gave the power away so that I could. I severed you from my hand, Draco. I built the case and filed the papers and made myself a stranger to your ruin, all so that I could stand here and say this to you and know it was clean. I want you, not the account, not the justice, not the 11 months. You." His breath left him all at once, as though he had been holding it for the length of the whole autumn. And then his hand came up and found the side of her face, the bare hand, healed now, warm now, exactly as it had in the office over the open ledger, except that this time there was no ledger, and this time he did not step back. His thumb moved along the line of her cheekbone. His grey eyes searched hers one last time, not for permission now, but for the sheer wonder of being permitted. And she saw the moment the last of his disbelief gave way, the moment 3 years of penance and 11 months of enmity and 6 weeks of unbearable silence finally released their grip on him and let him reach for the one thing he had refused himself, so long as refusing it was the only honest choice left. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of 2 people who had wanted each other briefly and easily. It was the kiss of 2 people who had spent the better part of a year on opposite shores of an impossible thing, who had earned every inch of the distance now closing, who had each, in their own way, been ruined and remade by the other. and it held all of that. It was slow at first, disbelieving, the tentative meeting of a man who could not quite trust that the ground beneath him would hold. And then she made a small sound against his mouth and pressed closer, her hand sliding from his lapel to the back of his neck into the frost-damp hair there, and the tentativeness broke, and it became something else, deep and certain and unhurried, a kiss with no clock ticking behind it and no hour to end on, the first thing in the whole of their acquaintance that belonged to no one but themselves. The winter light failed around them, unnoticed. The frost thickened on the window. Somewhere in the building, a door closed, and footsteps receded down a stone corridor and were swallowed, and neither of them heard it, because for the first time in the whole long history of the two of them, there was nowhere either of them had to be, and no arrangement that required their parting, and no ledger open on any desk to remind them what they were supposed to be to one another. When at last they drew apart, it was only far enough to breathe. His forehead came down to rest against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel the unsteadiness of his breath, and beneath her palm, at the back of his neck, the racing of his pulse, and she understood that for all his stillness, for all the composure he had worn like armor through 11 months of humiliation, he was as undone by this as she was, more perhaps because he had believed for so long that he deserved none of it. "I didn't think you'd come," she admitted very quietly into the small warm space between them. "These 6 weeks, I thought I'd taken the power away, and I thought the power was the only thing that ever brought you to me, and without it you'd simply go, and I'd never see you again, and I'd have done it to myself." "I nearly did," he said. His voice was rough. "Go. Stay away. I told myself you'd only felt it because of the strangeness of it all, the ledger, the storm, the power. That once it was gone, you'd come to your senses, and I'd be spared the humiliation of learning that what I felt in that office was one-sided." His hand tightened at her waist. "I came within an hour of not knocking. I stood in the corridor for longer than I'll ever admit to. And then I thought, she gave it all away. Every scrap of power she held over me, she signed it into a stranger's hands, and she did it for a reason, and there was only ever one reason it could be. So I knocked." A breath that was almost, not quite, a laugh. "I've never in my life been so frightened of a door." She pulled back far enough to look at him properly, at the frost melting in his hair, at the exhaustion gone from beneath his eyes, at the openness of his face that the ledger had never once permitted her to see. And she thought about the whole improbable road that had brought them here, the first Tuesday, and the loathing she had built her mornings around, the blank line that would not leave her. The library, and his hand coming down fast over hers, the bandaged fingers, the storm that had sealed them in a room together and made them, for 1 hour, merely two tired people watching the rain, the month of no clean path, the parchment with its plain black seal, and his terrible, generous offer to be ruined so that she could stay clean, and the third road, the one she had found at the last, that had cost her the one thing she had allowed herself in all of it, the power, the rightness, the clean, sustaining certainty of being the one who held the account. She had given it away, and in giving it away, she had lost nothing that was worth keeping, and gained the only thing she had come, without ever meaning to want. "Your mother," she said. "How is she?" Something moved in his face. Not grief this time, but its gentler cousin. "Better," he said. "Not cured. She won't be cured. We both know that. But the healer your application won her has done what I never could. She's comfortable. She sleeps through the night now. Yesterday she asked for her hairbrush and did her own hair for the first time in a year. And when I came in, she was sitting up by the window with the light on her, and for a moment..." His voice caught. He mastered it. For a moment she looked like herself again, like the woman she was before all of it. His eyes came back to hers, and there was something in them she had never expected to be the object of. Not from him, not in this life. "You did that. You, who had every reason in the world to let her waste. You built the case in a single night, and you gave her back her nights and her mornings and her hairbrush. And you did it for a woman whose sister carved a word into your arm in my own house while I stood there and did nothing." His hand found her wrist, the wrist above the scar, the one he had once put his body between and the drawing room door. "I will spend the rest of my life not deserving that. I've made my peace with it. There are debts, it turns out, that no ledger can hold and no penance can pay, and I owe you one, and I intend to owe it happily for as long as you'll let me. There's no ledger between us anymore," she reminded him softly. "You said so yourself. You owe me nothing." "I owe you everything," he said. "There's a difference. The first is a matter of law. The second is a matter of the heart, and I find at long last that I'm no longer afraid of it." And he lifted her scarred wrist to his mouth and pressed his lips to the skin above the old wound. The word he would not name, the word neither of them ever named. Not as an apology, because they were long past apologies, but as a promise, wordless and complete, that whatever that house had once meant, it would never mean it again. Not for her, not while he lived. She kissed him a second time for that. Outside, the first snow of the winter had begun to fall past the tall window, soft and unhurried, catching the last grey light and the amber of the office lamp and turning the whole world beyond the glass into something slow and white and clean. Neither of them noticed the snow either, not for a long while. But when at last they stood together at the window, with his arm around her and her head against his shoulder, watching the flakes come down over the darkening city, it seemed to Hermione the most extraordinary thing. That a story which had begun in the drumming grey rain of an autumn morning, in an office with a ledger between them and 11 months of hostility ahead, should have arrived here at this. The snow falling, the debt in honest and impersonal hands, his mother sitting up by her own window with the light on her hair, and the two of them standing in the warm lamplight with nothing at all between them anymore but the fact that they had, against every reason and every rule and every wound, chosen each other. She had held his life in her hands once. She had thought that was power. She understood now that it had been nothing of the kind, that the true thing, the only thing worth holding, was this: a life freely offered, with no ledger to compel it, no debt to demand it, no power on either side, but the equal and answerable power of two people who had decided, at last, to stop standing on opposite shores. "Stay," she said. Not a command, not the word she had once flung at a debtor across a desk. A question offered openly with everything in it. I have nowhere I need to be, he said, and she heard the wonder in it, the disbelief of a man to whom that had never once been true. For the first time in 3 years, Hermione, nowhere at all. Only here, if you'll have me. I'll have you, she said. And the snow came down, and the lamp burned amber against the early dark, and in the warm quiet of that room, the last of the distance between them closed for good, and stayed closed, and neither of them ever again had cause to measure the space between one shore and the other, because they had finally and permanently and by their own free choosing come to stand on the same one.
I want to tell you what I was thinking while I wrote this. The whole time I kept asking myself one question. Can a person be right and still be wrong? Hermione was right. The debt was real. The Malfoy family did terrible things. She had every reason to hold the power over him. Nobody could say she was unfair, but being right, it is not the same as seeing everything. There is one small moment I keep coming back to. It is the blank line in his ledger. Just an empty space on a page. He would rather lose his whole house than fill in it. And behind that empty space was his sick mother. He was selling his books to save her, alone in a cold house and telling no one. I loved writing that because sometimes the biggest pain in a person's life is the thing they say nothing about. So, what is the story really about? I think it's simple. Before you judge someone, look at what they carry in silence. The loud things are easy to see, the quiet things are the ones that matter most. Hermione held his life in her hands. She thought that was power, but real power was letting it go. She gave it all away so she could meet him as an equal, and only then could they truly choose each other. I hope this story made you feel something. If it did, that is the best gift you can give me. Take care of each other and watch for the quiet things. Thank you for listening.